welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us tonight. I'm Justine Nolan. I'm the Director of the Australian Human Rights Institute at UNSW, and I wanted to welcome you and acknowledge the land of the Bidjigal people on which UNSW sits, and also voice our support for the Uluru Statement from the Heart to support a process to provide Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island peoples with a voice in the laws and policies that are made about them. It's really wonderful to have such an interesting panel here tonight to celebrate the 30-year anniversary of the Human Rights Defender magazine. And for 30 years, the Human Rights Defender has been chronicling human rights issues in Australia and around the world, first as part of the Australian Human Rights Centre and now the Institute. And it's consistently featured the writing of really, leading rights activists and cutting edge issues to attempt to bring these issues to people that are not always so immersed in human rights. This is an absolutely bumper issue. And if you haven't had a look at it, please go to the Institute's website and have a read of the Human Rights Defender. And I particularly want to thank the editors of this edition, Dr. Annie Ketan, Josh Gibson, Dr. Claire Higgins, Angela Kintimanis, Amrika Sharma, and Andy Symington, who've just done an outstanding job, not only for this issue, but in previous issues as well. I also want to thank our Institute interns who've worked really hard on these, Grace James and Lugna Sharif, and also the Institute's communications manager, Drew Sheldrick, who's put an enormous amount of work into this issue. This issue is, we've got some of the members tonight talking about their articles, but there's 15 commentators who've contributed to this issue, and you can read all their wonderful articles on the website. And during our discussion tonight, I would love, if you're listening in, to welcome you to post any comments or questions in the chat, and I'll address them to our panelists as we go on. So let me just briefly introduce our panel and we'll go straight into the questions for tonight. Hugh Kretser is the Executive Director of the Human Rights Law Centre in Melbourne, a national not-for-profit organisation that uses strategic legal action and policy and advocacy to support people and communities to eliminate inequality and justice. Hugh has previously been involved and led community legal centres and also served as the Commissioner of the Victorian Law Reform Commission. Rebecca Peters is a human rights advocate, and nearly 30 years ago, while she was a law student, she wrote an article for the Human Rights Defender about gun ownership. So as I was just saying to her, we now basically take ownership of her very successful human rights career. Her advocacy to prevent gun violence has seen her become a recipient of the Officer of the Order of Australia and also received the Australian Human Rights Medal. She's played a really significant role in gun law reform in Australia, but also works on this issue globally, including most recently working with survivors of gun violence in Guatemala. Ketan Joshi is a writer, analyst, and science communicator. Well, probably saying a writer is understating it. He's a prolific writer and communicator, focusing on, in particular, clean energy and climate change. He has previously worked in this field for companies and government agencies, and now writes extensively in media and commentary, really from the front lines of climate and energy battles around the world. And he's coming to us today from Norway. And finally, Dr. Briony Lipton is a postdoctoral research associate with Women, Work and Leadership Research Group at the University of Sydney Business School. And she's particularly going to talk today about some of the issues around the future of work. So let's get started. I mean, it's easy as a human rights advocate to be really pessimistic about human rights, especially this week when we are watching the devastating news coming out of Afghanistan. And in the past 30 years, there really has been plenty of times that we could highlight when struggles around rights have not succeeded. But it's also, important to remember some of the successes that we have achieved in the last 30 years and that have been chronicled in this magazine, and also focus on the challenges that lie ahead. So I want to start with some of the current issues that are both highlighted and that we start to think about. And I'd also like to start on a bit of an optimistic front. So Hugh, in your article, you warn that failure is an inevitable part of social justice advocacy, but that when hope is alive, change is possible. So if we're going to start optimistically, in the last 30 years that the Human Rights Defender has been published and chronicling these issues, what do you see as some of the most significant human rights achievements in Australia?
Thanks. Justine, and just like acknowledge that I'm on Boonwurrung land here in what we now call Melbourne. Yeah, failure. You have to learn to come to terms with failure in human rights advocacy, but you can't lose hope, is the message that I sort of put in that article. And certainly for me, I draw hope from the inspirational people who are in human rights advocacy, the communities who stand up to protect their own rights, and the wins that they achieve. And so when you look, it is easy to get despondent about it, to see the Prime Minister's response to what's happening in Afghanistan, to see people who've been detained for 8 years, who've fled that conflict here, that they still will be denied permanent protection. And a treatment of refugees. I'm not starting on a hopeful note, am I? It stands out as one of the worst aspects of the last 30 years. But when you look back objectively, there has been so much progress, and that progress really should give us hope, and it should give us inspiration about what's possible. And it's certainly what drives us. And there's a lot of bad news around at the moment. So I wanted to share some good news, which is that the West Australian Parliament has just passed safe access zones, laws which have been proven to be effective, that stop the harassment and intimidation of women accessing reproductive health services. And Western Australia doing this means that we now have these laws in every single jurisdiction across Australia, started with Tasmania, ACT, Victoria, and so on. And it's these laws. The laws in Victoria, the day they came in outside the fertility control clinic in East Melbourne, there was no one. It was peaceful. That they had an immediate impact and they work. Decriminalisation of abortion is another issue where we've seen huge progress. Western Australia, again, is the last remaining state, and we're hopeful that will change in the next year. And I think when you look at marriage equality as a huge moment, we should never have had that plebiscite, but the fact that plebiscite, with all the challenges and the way that the vote was structured, delivered such a strong majority in favour of it, was a huge moment. And that moment was off the back of decades of advocacy by the LGBTI community. And when you go back, I actually looked at this just before we came online, and homosexuality was still criminalised in 1991, 30 years ago in Tasmania. I think Queensland had just decriminalised it. And so you go back to 30 years and you look at the tsunami of law reform, progressive law reform that's happened in that space. Of course, there is still ways to go. It's things like that you draw hope from. The plethora of anti-discrimination law, Disability Discrimination Act came in 1992, Mabo in 1992, native title, the apology, bringing them home report, federal government's just announced reparations for the stolen generation. So there is progress. It's not enough. It's coming too slow. We're going backwards in some areas, but overall we should draw hope.
Thanks, Hugh. I mean, I think it's really important to, and some of those issues when you sort of reel that off, you think about the magnitude of what those issues mean for many individuals, because a lot of the time we can get lost in the sort of the really big issues. We can't change anything, but all of those decisions significantly impact individuals, their daily life in many ways. Rebecca, to you, there's no doubt that gun reform was one of the significant victories in Australia in the last 30 years. And you probably 30 years ago didn't anticipate that you were then going to spend your life focused on this issue. Can you just draw out a little bit the connection between gun ownership, the debates around gun rights and human rights, and your thoughts on what that means in terms of Australia? Is Australia able to sustain that position, or do you feel like that we may, succumb to changes that might water down the rights that have achieved in the area of gun reform?
Yeah, thanks. In Australia, 30 years ago, before we made the big changes, there was a kind of a standoff in Australia where the gun laws were better than America, but not as good as as in some European countries. And there was a kind of this sort of no one could move on it because, like as it was in America, Australian state and territory governments felt frightened of the gun lobby, and it wasn't that they weren't strengthening the laws because they thought there was a right to have guns. They weren't strengthening the laws because they were concerned that the gun lobby would mobilize and vote them out of office. But there did begin to be, there was a moment when the American gun lobby began to function more internationally. And that was when we began to hear talk of a right to have a gun in Australia. And that, I guess, was when a lot of us kind of thought, we can't have this developing here. So the notion of gun ownership as a right never really took off in Australia. And one good thing about the changes in the laws that came after Port Arthur was that it's really clearly stated in the agreement that was made that gun ownership is a privilege here. But of course, the country where the business of rights and guns is constantly discussed is in America, where when you talk about guns and rights, it's usually thought to be talking about the rights of people to own guns. But of course, in the rest of the world, if you talk about guns and rights, the first concern is about the rights of people to be free from gun violence, the right of victims and potential victims. So it's a weird kind of difference between the US and the rest of the country in terms of whose rights are the ones that are considered that need to be protected. But luckily for the rest of the world, America is pretty much on its own in that regard, where the notion of human rights is that the human right to be protected is unfortunately very often that of the gun owners. But that has caused the noise that's come out of America has caused a lot of discussion to go on internationally, and that's been quite helpful to try to kind of tease out how gun ownership and gun proliferation affects human rights, all the different human rights. So there's been a lot of thinking about that over the years. I forgot. Oh, you asked me where we are now and how likely. So the situation we're in now, which is kind of, I remember at the time when we were really in the thick of the fight to get the laws changed around the time of Port Arthur, which was a very frightening time for people who are old enough to remember. There were a lot of frightening threats made and things like that. And as people became aware of how in some parts of Australia, how really poorly regulated guns were and what a risk that was. But I remember saying to someone, there'll become a time when we'll look back on this and everyone will say, well, what was all the fuss about? And we are actually at that point now. Like now it seems to most people like it would be unthinkable that semi-automatic weapons would be freely available in Australia and things like that. But the difficulty is that because we got our laws changed in an agreement between the states that they would all change their laws, but there's no mechanism to prevent any state from watering them down. It still relies just on political will and public opinion. And as the laws have been successful, we don't constantly have gun violence in the news. My concern is that the parliamentarians are not thinking about it. No one's kind of thinking we've got to protect our gun laws, but there has been a much more the pro-gun lobby that's against that would like to water down the gun laws has become much more active and systematic in its lobbying, and there is a kind of effort to get them watered down. And I guess my concern is that with the sorts of governments that we have now in Australia, so often every issue becomes just, well, will it win us? Can we use it against the other side? Or it's like everything is. There's no topic that is really that governments will really defend on their merits. Everything is just up for horse trading. Well, okay, because the parliaments are finally balanced, and so We have seen some watering down of the laws in places where governments are trying to get the minor parties to support other types of policy changes. So that's what that worries me, is we don't have any mechanism to prevent them being watered down, and so I do fear for that. But the new gun laws, they're not new anymore, but the changes that came about now 25 years ago was such a huge step forward that we're still much safer than we were.
Thanks. I mean, you sort of talk about the role of government and the way that they make decisions, and it's fair to say that now and in the last few years they're very poll driven, partly because of this fine balance, but sort of less, perhaps arguably sometimes less principled and less driven by what they think will get them re-elected, which is a perfect segue to you, Ketan, in terms of thinking about the issue that you wrote about, which was looking at climate change and declaring climate emergency in Australia. And while at the start I said, let's be optimistic, it's probably harder in your area to do that. Your article, at the start of your article, you invoke this sort of bathtub metaphor where you say, if it's overflowing, do you race to the tap or do you wait for the following week to buy a mop? Given Australia's lukewarm response to the latest IPCC report, is there any sort of doubt in your mind that really what we're doing as a nation is just waiting to buy the mop? And, sort of how do we get past that point?
Yeah, great question. So no, there is no doubt in my mind. And in fact, since writing that article, there's many more lines of evidence to support that. And I'll invoke one. There was a speech that Scott Morrison gave recently, and a journalist asked him, why aren't you setting a strong 2030 target? You sort of, a lot of the discourse is around 2050, but why aren't you upgrading Australia's 2030 target? If we abide by our current target, we'll emit way too much to keep in line with global, the most ambitious targets from the Paris Agreement. And Scott Morrison responded with something that was really, really telling. And I found it odd that it didn't get more attention. He said, this is how technology works. Technology starts off low, and then in the sort of distant future, it ramps up and you get to do more with technology to solve climate change. And he actually drew the chart with his hand in the talk. And I was like, that is exactly the absolute heart of what he's doing on climate change, which is basically trying to put off action until 1 or 2 decades into the future. And he's couching it on the grounds that we don't have the technology to start acting on this problem today. And that is manifestly untrue. We know for sure that we have the technology. We also, of course, have to do many other things in addition to installing new infrastructure and technology. We have to make a bunch of social, corporate, political, and cultural changes. And so he's not even really engaging with the very, very, very first step of this problem, let alone all the stuff that has to come after that to make short-term changes really, really feasible. The second part of your question was, what do we actually do about this? What actions can we take to make climate action happen way more in the present than sort of pushed off into the future? And that I don't have a particularly amazing answer to that, because it's something that because this entire problem is so novel, everybody working in climate action is kind of scrambling to figure out how to do this, because our species has essentially never encountered a problem like this before in history. We really are finding that targeting short-term actions is a really, really important thing to do. So companies and countries around the world are now sort of announcing these 2050 targets and then stepping back and not doing much after that. There was an analysis I was just reading yesterday about corporations around the world, like what are they doing on climate change? And many of them have now declared net zero targets, but not many of them have allocated capital that would be aligned with the kind of climate change targets that we're interested in. And so just to sort of loop it back to the first part of your question, yesterday, BHP, a sort of extremely large fossil fuel company in Australia, announced a merger with Woodside, which is of course another one of the other big fossil fuel companies in Australia. And in their plan, you can sort of look at they've included their climate plan in the announcement. And they've got this really telling, all the really interesting stuff is always kind of buried in the details, but you dig in and it's got, this is how we're going to go from like these emissions to these sort of lower emissions in the future. And they've got 2040 as an end date. And the very first column is an increase, it's growth in emissions because they're expanding their fossil fuel projects. And then the next step is some sort of tweaks to operations. So keep in mind, this is only emissions from producing fossil fuels, oil and gas. And then the next one is the biggest sort of chunk by far, and it just says in tiny text below it, offsets. And so that involves tree planting. It could involve in the future technology, so machines that actually suck carbon from the air. Both of them are highly problematic and cannot be used as a substitute for real world emissions reductions, but they are being used as a substitute because that's the MOP, right? This is the sort of vision of the future in that, you know, we're not going to turn the tap off. In fact, this climate plan released yesterday literally has a bar in it that says, not only are we not turning the tap off, but we're turning the tap up. We're actually expanding the production of fossil fuels. And so that freaked me out. I was reading that and I was like, oh man, that makes me feel so bad, because it shows actually that the culture deep down, not just in, you know, the federal government gets a lot of focus on this, but of course, we have to think about corporate culture and we have to think about how it's thought about in boardrooms and lobby groups and things like that around the world as well. And so just one more quick thing on that. Yes, last week the IPCC report came out, and just to tie into how we actually make people treat this with a lot more immediate urgency, they had this great line in it that basically just said, every ton is doing harm. Every new ton of greenhouse gases that we release actually has a linear physical consequence on the Earth's, on our habitat, on the thing that we rely on to exist and subsist. And so I think that message is really clear and really important. I hope more people can hear it, because it might actually bring about the change we want.
But at least we have that trajectory of technology to save us. So I think that's good, because he has been also using that in relation to vaccines. We've got the trajectory. So I think that's a good, you know, sign to have, which in technology brings us to you, Briony, who you're part of a major research project that's looking at the future of work. And part of that is looking at the impact of technology and the gendered impacts of the future of work and technology. So in the research that you're doing, what are, you know, sort of how is technology predicted, or how is technology impacting, in particular, changes in how it's impacting women in the workplace?
Yeah, thanks. So our project is looking at how women and men understand and experience the changing nature of work and their hopes and fears for the future. And so this includes workplace transformations occurring in high and low paid jobs, to ensure that, you know, existing gender inequalities and class inequalities are not going to be replicated or amplified into the future. And so we're looking at retail and law, and both of those sectors are experiencing rapid workplace intensification and technological change, such as automation and the outsourcing of work, increases in job precarity, and career pathways are becoming a lot less clearly defined. So in retail, online shopping is a big thing, shifting employment opportunities from stores to distribution centres. We have self-checkout machines, that's really commonplace now, and iPads as well. Sort of that smart technology is changing how workers interact with customers. Technology is also being used to surveil workers more closely. And in the law, firms are increasingly relying on freelance or casualised solicitors to bid on and compete for projects. So the legal profession is becoming much more diversified, and digitisation and machine learning applications are also beginning to automate legal tasks as well, like document review. So even though women make up over half of all solicitors at the national level and also at the state and territory level, their advancement in the profession has been incredibly slow. And so when you look at automation and the routine, that sort of automation of routine tasks, it's going to be more likely that it's women who perform those tasks, and they're going to be the ones that are vulnerable to that displacement. in the legal profession.
Thanks for that. And I want to sort of continue this trajectory of looking forward a bit. But before I do so, I also want to acknowledge that, as I said at the start, there's a number of other commentators who are involved in this issue and some who are on the line. And I can see Patrick Earle, Chris Sidoti, Priyanthi Fernando, who have all produced really interesting articles that I encourage you to read. But also on the line are some people who are involved in this magazine as it was developing early on, including Andrea Durback, who was the director of the Human Rights Centre, and Diane McDonald, who was running and managing this magazine for many years through her work at the Australian Human Rights Centre. So thank you to all of you as well. If we take this sort of looking forward issue a little bit, looking forward, looking back, Hugh, in your article, you sort of look at 30 years ago, and particularly looking at the Royal Commission into Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, and in sort of laying out a roadmap at that point of what needed to happen to address this issue. So we're 2021 and we're still seeing shocking rates of death of Indigenous people in custody, and there's been some changes and not much changes. So how do you think that looking forward, how do we turn the tide on this particular issue that you mentioned in your article?
Yeah, so 30-year anniversary this year, and that Royal Commission, it's an extraordinary document and laid out a really, the key finding of that inquiry was that Aboriginal people are dying in jail at high rates because they've been locked up at high rates. And so the key to address that is to stop locking up Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people at that high rate. Yet what's happened is those rates have got worse over the last 30 years. And so it's a disgrace that that's happened. And when you look at, we worked on the death in custody of Tanya Day, who died in police custody after being arrested. She died after falling in police custody and suffering head injuries after being arrested for public drunkenness when she was on a train and wasn't monitored properly. According to policy, the coroner said it was highly critical of Victoria Police and subconscious or conscious racism involved in the response on the train. And her uncle was one of the deaths investigated by the Royal Commission 30 years earlier. So a really awful circumstance for that family, but made worse because the Royal Commission recommended the decriminalisation of public drunkenness 30 years ago. If that had been done in Victoria, Tanya Day would never have died. And the Victorian government has agreed to make that reform and has passed laws to abolish the crime of public drunkenness and replace it with a Aboriginal-led public health response. So that commitment is good, and it's good that those laws have passed through Parliament in February this year, but it's obviously, it shouldn't take 30 years and deaths like that for that kind of change to happen. And too often, I think what we're seeing over the last 30 years is a far greater recognition of the crisis of Aboriginal over-imprisonment. The Black Lives Matter movement in the US, the Australian version of that has shone a spotlight on Aboriginal deaths in custody and over-imprisonment. Governments are paying lip service to the need to address that and doing some things which are positive, but too often when the governments are presented with a choice of doing something that's actually going to work to reduce Aboriginal over-imprisonment, and it's not driven by crime rates, it's driven by policy choices by government responding to largely disadvantage in communities, and they know what works, they could invest in the things that work, but instead they're increasing penalties, making bail harder to get. We've got the reform of raising the age of criminal responsibility. Australia is locking up kids as young as 10. It's completely out of step with medical evidence, international standards, child rights recommendations, and yet Australian governments aren't acting on that. Huge public support for that reform, but politicians are scared of law and order backlash if they make that kind of reform. And so they're some of the challenges about getting it. But I actually am hopeful. I think raising the age will happen. It will force governments to support kids who are in trouble and get their lives on track, rather than responding with a blunt and often harmful criminal justice response.
Thanks. And I mean, Rebecca, one of the issues that Hugh has just highlighted is that really massive challenge of getting structural reform on a grand scale. And obviously, particularly in the area around gun reform, the spotlight is so often on the US, as you mentioned. Do you see there's a path forward there for real structural reform to deal with this issue in the US?
Gosh, well, it's often hard to be optimistic about the US. I mean, for example, there is in the US a federal agency, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco and Firearms, which is in charge of enforcing and monitoring and doing something. And they've been for 15 years unable to appoint a director. So they've just had a series of acting directors because the Congress won't approve anyone to be the director, because the gun lobby is so powerful in stopping anyone being appointed who might be able to actually, make that agency more effective. And it's very difficult when that position isn't properly filled. And also, well, there's lots of reasons to be pessimistic about the US. On the other hand, in many states, there has been steady progress. I talk a lot to US state lawmakers who ask me about, well, how do you deal with this aspect or that aspect in Australia? Of course, the difficulty with going with one little bit at a time, and part of the good thing we did in Australia was we did a comprehensive, we not only limited, we banned certain types of weapons, but we also put in place the things that you need to be able to make that ban work. And we took a really comprehensive approach, and that's very hard to get to. In the US, they put all their efforts into getting like one little tweak passed somewhere. Another big problem in the US, of course, is that it is the major exporter. It's the major producer of guns in the world, and the main exporter, both legally and illegally, of guns to the rest of the world. So although we often feel like, oh, let's just, why are we always talking about the US? Let's just leave the US out of it. But actually, they're the source of so much of the problem. So the whole world has to be worried about their policies. It's very hard, and because you have to do the cultural change, structural change at the same time. And the idea in the US that's very pervasive, this sort of, they're much more prone to thinking simplistically, like, well, the world divides into good people and bad people, and it's only the bad people who shouldn't have guns, and it's fine if the good people do. That kind of idea is so prevalent there that it becomes really difficult to have a proper, just normal, intelligent policy conversation. So it is difficult but you've got to be this. But the good thing is there's tons of really good people working on it in the US, and so I just have to believe that they will be able to make some progress.
I mean, human rights advocates are eternal optimists. Otherwise, you wouldn't be doing, working in the industry that you are. But this sort of big idea of big reforms, Ketan, is a problem, obviously, with climate as well. And your article looks at a scenario in which Australia treats climate change as an emergency and declares it to be an emergency, which New Zealand did to sort of much fanfare last year. What happens after that? What happened, what's the results of that declaration? Is that the sort of the silver bullet that we're looking for that will help us address, or at least start more substantively on this issue in Australia?
It would certainly be a really important step towards doing what I described before, which is treating greenhouse gas emissions as if they cause harm. I wrote a piece last weekend after watching the sort of response to the IPCC report, which was released the Monday before last, which of course, warned not just of that principle that every greenhouse gas we add is doing damage, but also of the consequences in aggregate. So when you sort of continue along the pathway that we're on, the consequences are astonishingly bad. And so we need to get off that pathway, and the IPCC report does not actually go into detail the actions that could be taken. This is the first part of 3 reports, essentially. The third part being how you mitigate climate change comes out, I think it's March or May next year. So there's a huge gap between the warning and then the actions that you take to address the warning. And so what happened is actually earlier this year, there was a great report from the International Energy Agency, who for a long time, they were actually set up in the 70s by Kissinger as part of a response to the oil crisis, the global oil crisis. So they have not traditionally been particularly an enemy of the fossil fuel industry, but this year they released this report, which they called Net Zero by 2050 for the energy sector. And everyone was quite astonished because it actually outlined some really substantial and clear actions that could be taken. And so in the context of Australia, and of course, very much where I live right now, Norway, one that really stood out is stop exploring for new fossil fuels. We don't need any more. If we were to actually burn the stuff that we're exploring for, the consequences would be disastrous. It would be catastrophe. So why are you opening up new gas fields and new coal mines, et cetera, et cetera? And so that would be the very first step that you would take if you were to be treating it as an emergency and understanding that greenhouse gases do damage. The next step would actually be relating to coal and to cars. So first step would be shut down coal power in rich countries by 2030. This is a really, really important thing to do. The rate limiter for shutting down coal is community and of course the rights of the people who live in those communities that have been reliant on having a power station in their town for a really long time. It's not technological. We know how to replace coal. We know how to generate electricity without coal. We know how to balance grids using renewables. This is all done and dusted a decade ago. So it's actually a social and democratic issue. And of course, that's hard. That should be the focus. But of course, when you look at discourse around this, it's always about, oh, well, we can't keep the lights on if we turn the coal plants off too soon. The next part, of course, is transport. So we should actually be very, very urgently shifting the sale of vehicles from combustion engines to electric vehicles. We should be encouraging active transport, public transport. That, of course, has its own inbuilt equity issue because currently it's actually there's a sort of price differential between combustion engine vehicles and electric vehicles. Again, I live in Norway. That has one of the highest penetration rates for electric vehicles in the world, but it's actually still pretty hard to get an electric car. I can't get an electric car. I use public transport and I cycle and I walk instead. So really there has to be options for people to decarbonize their lifestyles without having to spend a lot of money or take a financial risk. And so all of these first steps in the emergency would actually have to really become very clearly and very intentionally paired with a focus on justice and equity and the rights of the people who would be affected by these changes, both in a positive way and a negative way. I think that's a really, really important consideration. But that would be the first step. And you brought up New Zealand. New Zealand has declared a climate emergency. But they are still lagging behind in taking those first steps. So of course, they're not a big fossil exporter. They're not even really a particularly big burner of fossil fuels. That sort of domestic emissions from burning fossil fuels are relatively low, but they have a really big agriculture industry. And methane was a focus of the IPCC report last week. The damage caused by methane is very, very severe, many, many more times than carbon dioxide. Thankfully, the volume that we emit, of course, is lower than carbon dioxide. And when you stop emitting methane, the changes to the atmosphere, it sort of fixes itself a lot sooner. So that's a good thing. But New Zealand is not taking sufficient action to figure out ways to reduce its methane emissions. It is very, very hard. Methane and agriculture in particular are one of those sort of hard to abate sectors. We don't have like an easy technological replacement for dairy or for meat farming. So that actually is going to involve some cultural change as well. I won't go into it. That's no,
I mean,
it's
clear that, obviously first we need a plan, and then we actually need to follow a plan and have a timeline to through it, rather than just making a declaration, but then not following through, which is the classic error with so many governments. And sort of having a plan and reconciling issues around rights. Hugh, I mean, one of the issues that Australia doesn't have that has been brought up consistently is that we don't have a National Human Rights Act or a Human Rights Charter. And so particularly when COVID has hit and there's been restrictions on rights, and I want to, in a moment, come to you, Briony, to talk about the impact of COVID and the gendered workforce. But Hugh, I mean, do you feel like in Australia that's an area that is significant, or we're doing okay without a charter? Would the reaction to COVID have been any different if we'd had something to look at how we balance those rights?
I think COVID highlights the value of a human rights charter. I mean, COVID's a global human rights crisis. Millions of people are dying around the world, and governments, to protect life and health as they should, are imposing restrictions and having to make often agonizing decisions about when and how hard to go in terms of restrictions. We're all living that right now across Australia, New Zealand, etc. And so what a charter does is provide a very powerful compass to help governments to make those decisions right. It provides a very useful guide for communities to judge those decisions, and where people are affected unfairly, where governments don't do enough or do too much, a charter working properly provides people with redress. And so we saw that in Victoria last year. The curfew introduced, I think, around this time last year, it's just been reintroduced. Hugely controversial. I think the first curfew in Victoria ever. And you had the police chief commissioner saying we didn't ask for it, the chief health officer saying, I think in the media, that he didn't ask for it. And so people were rightly saying, what's the public health justification for this measure? And a business owner brought a case under the charter challenging that. And it was actually it was an important case which showed that actually the public health commander who introduced that piece of that order around the charter did give proper consideration to people's human rights, did look at the evidence as to why a charter was, why a curfew was justified, and the business owner who was challenging that didn't introduce any contrary public health evidence to say, no, you didn't need this. You could have protected public health properly and reasonably without this restriction on freedom of movement. And so for me, that was the transparency and accountability that a charter provides. Obviously, there are tens of thousands of Australians overseas who are trying to get home, who are stranded there. The Universal Declaration, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, standards that Australia's promised to comply with at the international level, have not been implemented under Australian law. And those standards say that people have a right to leave their own country and to return to their own country. And you can only limit that if there's a very good reason and you do it in the least restrictive way. And so when the Australian government was threatening people, Australian citizens in India, with jail and with fines if they happen to get out of India and escape that crisis, that was another example of where a charter, if we had one at the national level, would have provided an important guide and protection to say, you're going too far with this. Mandatory vaccination, curfews, border controls, border restrictions, playgrounds are controversial at the moment. All of these things, I think, that frame of looking at the human rights framework and saying, yes, you're trying to protect life and health. Are you doing it in the least restrictive way possible? It's a very powerful test to help governments. Unfortunately, we do not have a charter at the national level. We have one in Victoria. We've got one in Queensland and the ACT. And I wouldn't be doing my job properly if I wasn't promoting the campaign to get a national charter, charterofrights.org.au. So we're trying to change that. There's been attempts, we're talking about 30 years, there's been attempts which have been unsuccessful, most recently with the inquiry chaired by Frank Brennan, which showed that there was huge public support for a human rights charter. Also talked about the importance of human rights education. Unfortunately, the Rudd government didn't implement the recommendation to introduce a charter, and we're hopeful that we can change that.
And here we are with you in lockdown 6. With the curfew again, and
Is it 6?
So I'm guessing it's 6. Oh yeah, I've lost track of yours, but and so one of the things to think about that the human rights defender has highlighted over the 30 years is that human rights itself and the mechanisms it has are not always going to provide you with the magical answer that you want. But as Hugh highlighted, that a lot of the time what they do is provoke a debate and have transparency. And so it puts, it's put the issues up on center stage and basically say, well, justify why you're not doing this. Justify why you're not taking action on climate, or why you're taking, lessening gun actions on gun restrictions. Why, and so that's what a charter can help. I mean, and COVID has really highlighted these issues. So, Briony, in your work, when you're looking at the sort of the gendered impacts and the future of work, COVID has obviously had a significant impact on the workforce. But I imagine what you're looking at is also seeing these particular acts very, very significant on women.
Yeah, definitely. The pandemic has really revealed and in many cases exacerbated long-standing gendered inequalities at work and at home. And my colleagues that I work with, Professor Ray Cooper and Dr. Mariah Foley, and also Professor Elizabeth Hill at the University of Sydney, have recently published on the gendered impact of the pandemic. Women have been disproportionately exposed to the virus at work. They're as frontline workers in sort of essential industries and occupations, which are also highly feminized. So, women have also then experienced greater job losses as they're workers in industries that have been most affected by business closures and government mandated lockdowns. And then again, with schools and childcare's closed for, weeks and months on end, women have also shouldered a larger burden of unpaid domestic duties at home and are experiencing greater risk of domestic violence as well. But none of this is new. This is what feminists have long been arguing is happening and fighting for change in these areas. So one of the methods in our project on the future of work is a representative worker survey in both the retail industry and the law profession. And these are about to go into the field very soon. So that's really exciting. And I'm really, really interested in finding out how men and women in these sectors perceive the impact of COVID and the changes to their workplaces, and how COVID has sort of set in motion some of these changes as well. But from the disruption caused by the pandemic, it also is an opportunity to establish new directions as well for workplace gender equality. So thinking about the future of work and the future of gender equality, this is really the time now, as we sit in lockdown, to be addressing these, gender-based labour market segregations and discrimination, and building access to mutually beneficial flexibility, and ensuring a more gender equitable distribution of unpaid care, and confronting gender-based violence as well, moving forward.
I mean, that's a really good point, because it's so easy to get immersed in all the problems that COVID has given us, but it also has given us insight into changes that would have taken much longer to happen in the workplace, particularly around flexibility perhaps, and diversity around roles that women have been arguing for decades, or the last 30 years, or much longer than that. And so it may have advanced that movement. So we're coming to the end of our time, and I wanted to sort of put a question to each of you, which I didn't forewarn you about, that if I was gathering you again in 30 years to have this discussion, what would be the thing that you would want to have happened in that 30 years, particularly, might be in your particular field, or it might just be in an area of human rights that you're interested in. But if we're chatting again in 30 years and I say, well, what happened with that? What is the one advance that you would be, or one change that you would hope to happen? So Rebecca, let me throw you into that question first.
Abolish the patriarchy.
So that should be easy.
Like just, I don't know what's it going to take to just get over this so deeply entrenched misogyny, and I mean, obviously this week, because of Afghanistan, which just something that is weighing so heavily on all of us. But even just looking, at Australia, you look at who's in power in countries that are not Afghanistan, and you think, how do we still have these guys running the place? And how is it that that's the fundamentally most important structural change I think I wish we could see.
That's a really interesting point to focus on. Ketan, what would be the area that you would like to see a change in?
There's a really obvious answer I could give, which is emissions drop to 0 by 2050. But I'm going to give the slightly vaguer answer of, I actually really hope that within 30 years, we've established a really widespread realization that achieving both crisis response outcomes, but also social justice and human rights outcomes at the same time is not a compromise. It's not a sort of like, it's not even really a balance. It's actually something that you can do simultaneously in parallel. And that's something widely available. Very, very important, of course, for pandemics, but also for climate change, because I think actually getting to net zero by 2050 will happen around the world if we realize that as a sort of necessary component of that process.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really insightful comment. And when you think about, because so much of how it's set up, whether it's climate or the reactions to the pandemic is, it's climate, we save the world or we ruin business, or, we protect public health or we put away with everyone's rights, that there is no in between. And we've become this very divisive society about many of these issues. And to think that there is a way of actually moving forward without necessarily giving one thing up for the other is the whole essence of international human rights law, which is looking at a balance, looking at prioritization, that at certain times or on certain issues, their weight may be certain, a little bit different, but there is a way of meshing those together. Briony, to you, what advance would you like to be thinking about in your field?
Yeah, definitely. Well, I'd love to see the destruction of the patriarchy as well. That would be great. But yeah, definitely, gendered attitudes and gendered inequalities in society become normalized in workplaces. So we can't look at, home and work as these sort of separate areas, and we have to look at them together. So, but at the same time, principles of gender equality and diversity and inclusion can also be taken up in these really superficial ways in the workplace. So I'd like to see more nuance into gendered attitudes, societal attitudes, and how we can really, change that, which I think will make a big impact.
I think we're very good at superficiality in Australia about many issues. So that would be one to take more. And finally, Hugh, what would you be looking for?
My immediate reaction was equality, and I thought of that when I was just preparing for tonight, because you look back over 30 years and you go, oh, we've made big advances in terms of racism, sex discrimination, LGBTIQ discrimination, so on, yet there's still such entrenched problems. But I want to go broader than that, and I think one of the huge successes of the human rights movement is to say, when you think back on, slavery, colonialism, racism, and the like, we have had this radical shift to say that everyone values, everyone matters, everyone has these rights, which are the basic things we all need to lead a decent, dignified life. And that speaks to everyone in every situation around the world, no matter who you are or where you are. The problem that we haven't achieved is how to get us thinking properly about the rights of other people. So we still define our rights in opposition often to others. And so the transformation I'd love to see is a cultural and educational one where Australia turns into the compassionate nation we should be, where we say, these human rights, they belong to me, but I also care about them for other people. And I also recognize, sort of building on what Ketan said, is that when they're realized, it's better for everyone. We're not losing anything, we're gaining everything. Our society will be stronger, healthier, more peaceful, more stable. That would be, we've got 30 years to achieve it.
Yeah, well, that's what we said 30 years ago. And that, very succinctly and very neatly brings together all the issues that we focused on tonight, particularly around the workplace, climate and guns, is that there is this perception that, one right has to be better than the others, and that we're not all equal and we're not all deserving of these issues, and there's this for and against approach with it. I really want to thank you for such an interesting conversation and for joining us from all over the places in various stages of lockdown. But Ketan, you're probably not in lockdown, so you should go out in Oslo and celebrate, even though it's 10 a.m. in the morning, but please go out and have a beer for us. I want to thank all of you for joining us today, and particularly the people I mentioned before, the editors, the interns, Drew, the previous managers of the guardians of this magazine over the years, and the other contributors who have been on their line for your excellent articles in this edition. I really encourage you to go to our website and read it, you know, and have a look at the Defender. I also want to just plug before we go, we've got a few upcoming events. On August 24th, we've got an event on vaccine passports and balancing rights and responsibilities during COVID. You can join that and register for that online. On the 22nd of September, the Institute is co-hosting an event with the Human Rights Law Centre that Hugh will also be speaking at, around this issue of the need for a human rights charter, and particularly looking at it on the perspective of the right to health. And in October, the Human Rights Institute, along with the George Institute and the University of Southern California, is hosting a major online conference on health and human rights in the climate crisis. So we'll be looking at a number of those issues, and there is some information on our website, but we're about to go live with the program this week or next week. So I really encourage you to keep an eye out for that, because we'd love to have you all join us for that. So many thanks to you all, panelists. Thanks for joining us, and have a lovely evening. Night.
Thank you.
Thanks
Thank
all.
you so
Thanks,
much.
Alex.
Very inspiring.